بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم تسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. We have reached the 42nd Hikma, the 42nd aphorism of this blessed collection of aphorisms by Ibn Ata'il al-Sikandari radiyallahu ta'ala anhu wa ardah. And this is one of the more esoteric aphorisms that goes a little bit deep, and it relates to the direction of our heart and what it is that we are seeking. And instead of, as we normally do, kind of go into a little bit of what's taken as a given, we'll probably come back to that as we start talking about some of these subtleties. Because the danger of being exposed to a more esoteric aphorism is that we sometimes think that the path that somehow negates the path of getting there, where the proper way to put this into practice is to understand this and to work on oneself, and that the path to getting there, sometimes you're not doing the highest thing of all, but you're doing something that's acceptable. And it's important to know that what you're doing is acceptable while trying to move to a higher degree, as opposed to the perspective of this is right and everything else is wrong. There's a base level, and then there are higher degrees. This is probably the best way to look at it. And so the Arabic, and this is a longer one, so I'm going to read it in parts. لا ترحل من كون إلى كون فتكون كحمار الرحى يسير والذي ارتحل إليه هو الذي ارتحل منه. So do not move from one created thing to another, lest you be like a donkey turning a mill, whose destination is his point of departure. ولكن الحل من الأكوان إلى المكون. Rather, move from created things to the creator. And then he quotes a verse, وَأَنَّ إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ الْمُنْتَهَى, that the final goal is your Lord. That the final goal is your Lord. وَانظُرْ إِلَىٰ قَوْلِهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم, consider the Prophet's words صلى الله عليه وسلم. فَمَنْ كَانَ هجرته إلى الله ورسوله فهجرته إلى الله ورسوله ومن كان هجرته إلى دنيا يصيبها أو امرأة يتزوجها فهجرته إلى ما هاجر إليه. So our Prophet said, whoever migrated to Allah and His Messenger, then his migration was to Allah and His Messenger. And whoever migrated for worldly gain or marriage with a woman, then his migration is for that which he migrated. فافهم قوله عليه الصلاة والسلام وتأمل هذا الأمر إن كنت ذا فهم والسلام. So understand his saying, prayer and peace be upon him, and contemplate this matter if you have understanding, peace. So this is going to require a bit of unpacking. It's a longer one. And so this could be summarized as really trying to impart to us the importance of our only desire should be to know Allah. What he's saying is, only desire to know Allah. Only desire to know Allah. So as for the linguistic breakdown, again, we'll just go very briefly through here. The pivot of this aphorism is around this word, rahala yarhalu. And rahala yarhalu is to set out. It's to depart. It's to leave. It's quite literally to leave the place you're in to go somewhere else. And this is where we get the word rihla, which the word rihla means a voyage, a trip. And that you have different meanings to that. Of course, it could be used in the broadest sense. And then you have this idea of rihla, of traveling for the sake of knowledge. But in the spiritual path, it also has an important meaning. And here in the spiritual path, we speak of it as spiritual traveling, spiritual wayfaring, spiritual voyaging, turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, going to Allah ta'ala, moving towards Allah tabarak wa ta'ala, of course, in a spiritual sense. So the idea of that rihla, in his saying here, la tarhal, and there's different ways you could translate that. You could say, do not travel. You could say, do not go. Or you could say, do not move. La tarhal. Do not go, travel, or move. Min kaun ila kaun. So, kana yakunu. The kaun is the universe, the cosmos, created things. And so what he's saying here is that do not move from kaun, one created thing, ila kaun, another created thing. And then he gives an example. The metaphor of that will be like the himar, akramakumullah. And of course, this is actually a huge insult to call someone a himar. But the whole point here is that in the spiritual path, if you don't know how to travel, is that you're inept and you lack understanding the way that we normally associate that ineptness and that stupidity with donkeys. And outwardly, if someone calls you a donkey, you're not going to be too happy about that. But in the spiritual path, we should train ourselves that we actually think that we're worse than donkeys. And one of the Salihin said, no one can possibly humiliate me or criticize me in a way that I haven't already humiliated or criticized myself. And this is how you have to be with your own nafs. Now we have to understand what this means psychologically, and there's a balance to this, of course. Because some people might hear these techniques and be like, oh, but what about da 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 da? In a balanced person, when this is applied in a balanced way, the whole point here for these people is to kill the ego and to suppress it. And even that, to use a more emphatic word, to annihilate it. Because the ego, by consensus of the scholars of this path, is the biggest veil between you and Allah. The biggest veil of all. It's worse than 70 shaitans. Akhbath, than 70 shaitans, the ego. And the ego is the means of all of the chaos in the world. All fitna. All fitna stems from the ego. And in a world that's just blowing up your ego, and in a world that's creating narcissist after narcissist, and egoist after egoist, and hedonist after hedonist, all of which centers around the ego, is that the path to Allah Ta'ala is the absolute opposite, diametrically opposed to that. And you can't arrive to Allah, meaning knowledge of Him, without conquering the ego. And so for people of the spiritual path, is that they welcome this challenge to not be considered to the people of the Shaitan to be like what would a himar, a donkey. And they're trained such that if someone actually did call them donkey, or they said something, insulted them, criticized them, called them a munafiq, hypocrite, called them terrible, unethical, on and on and on and on, is that it doesn't affect them. Other than for them to really be introspective. Did I do anything wrong? Did I say anything wrong? Did I do anything wrong? Could I have done something better? Did I not give them their right? And they start to think as opposed to defend themselves. And they're not bothered by the insult in of itself because they've already criticized their own self. And they actually believe in their heart that they're worse than a donkey or a dog or some type of predatorial beast or a pig or something of that nature. May Allah Ta'ala protect us, preserve us from really being like that. But this is how we have to notice traits in ourselves that remind us of those animals. And we actually don't really know in reality if we're better than animals or inanimate objects, unless we pass the traverse and enter into paradise. Anyhow, this is the metaphor that he gives. Donkeys are not known for their intelligence. And in particular here, he says you're going to be like a himar al-raha. Al-raha is a mill. And nowadays, most mills are machines. But back in the day, it was very common. And still in some places, you might find it on certain farms in certain places, where you'll see like a millstone, and the donkey is going around in a circle. It is doing something, grinding something, doing something, right, to generate energy. It's just going around like that. And so what he's saying here is that kahimar al-raha, like a donkey turning a mill, whose destination, irtahal is the same root, has the same root word as rahala, but it's on the eighth form. In other words, is that he's going around in a circle. As that his destination is his point of departure. As he goes around, he starts from where he ends up where he initially started from. And in the spiritual path, that's not how we want to be. We don't want to just be going around in circles. We don't want to just be like that donkey turning a mill. Walakin, rather, irhal. Again, he's now using it in the form of a command. That move from, that set out, that depart from. What? Al-akwan, which is the plural of kaun. Kaun, plural is akwan. To what? Ila al-mukawwin. To who? To the mukawwin. The mukawwin is the creator, the one who brought everything in the universe into existence. And then he quotes a verse, وَأَنَّ إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ الْمُنْتَهَى, that the final goal is your Lord. This is in Surah An-Najm. The muntaha of something is the final goal. It's the end of something. And the outward meaning of this is that into your Lord alone is the ultimate return of all things. But the esoteric meaning by way of ishara is that وَأَنَّ إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ الْمُنْتَهَى, is that ultimately the goal of the spiritual path ends in arriving to Allah. Arriving to Allah means receiving and attaining knowledge of Allah. That's the end. That is the final goal. That is what we are all seeking. That is what we should all want. Everything else is a means to attain that. And then he goes on, wandur. Here, wandur is better translated as like consider, reflect upon. The qawl, the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is a hadith that we all know. This is the first hadith of Bukhari. It's the first hadith of Riyad al-Salihin, of the Arba'in al-Nawawiyah. فَمَنْ كَانَتْ هِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ, whoever migrated to Allah and His Messenger, فَهِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ, then his migration was to Allah and His Messenger. Look at the meaning that Ibn al-Tayyiba wants us to think about. The Prophet said, فَمَنْ كَانَتْ هِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ, to Allah in His Messenger. So the hijrah here, which is migration, hajara, in hajara means to migrate. They outwardly migrated from where? From Makkah al-Mukarramah to Medina Munawwarah. But the people that were sincere in that migration, even though outwardly they migrated from Makkah al-Mukarramah to Medina Munawwarah, the reality of it was what? They were migrating to Allah and His Messenger. Outwardly, they moved from Mecca to Medina. Inwardly in their heart, they were drawing near to Allah and His Messenger. And then, those who didn't have the right intention, وَمَنْ كَانَ يَهْجُرُ إِلَى الدُّنْيَا يُصِيبُهُ امْرَأَةٍ يَتَزَوَّجُهَا, and whoever migrated for worldly gain, something of the world, any worldly purpose, or to marry a woman. Okay? هجرته إلى ما هاجر إليه. Then his migration is for that which he migrated. And this refers to, as we will see when we talk about its meaning, to someone's intention. You will get according, you receive what you intend behind anything. And look at the subtlety. Look at the subtlety. How important this is in everything that it is that we do. So let's look at some of these meanings, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And some of the authors point out that once you realize, according to the previous aphorism, and we realize is that we have nowhere else to turn in reality except to Allah. The previous aphorism states, it is truly astonishing how one flees from what is inseparable from him and seeks what does not remain with him. And then the verse in the Quran, indeed, it is not the eyes that are blind, but it is the hearts and the chests that grow blind. So what we seek as a sign of the heart's blindness or awareness. And so if this is the case, then we have no true travel or spiritual voyage, no true movement of the heart other than to Allah. And so once we know that, then what we should truly seek is knowledge of Him and nothing else. And this is where it starts to get a little subtle. So let's look at some of these meanings then that they say that relate to this meaning of that moving from one created thing to another, that going from one created thing to another, traveling from one created thing to another, is that this has a number of potential meanings. And so he says it's like someone who has zuhud in the dunya. They detach themselves from this world and they free themselves up to worship Allah Ta'ala. But they have subtle intentions in doing so, is that they just make things easier for themselves, for health reasons, for what other reasons, just so that they know that by turning away from the dunya that they'll actually get more dunya, whatever it might be. So there's some type of worldly benefit that comes their way in doing so. And if people don't think that this is a potential fear, then they probably don't know too much about how there are people in other religions that, and even within Islam, that make claims and they become famous for something, and in reality they're charlatans. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. And these people exist, and we have to be very careful about charlatans. We have to be careful. And their criterion that the people of this science have given us so that we can know who is rightly guided and who are people it's better to leave and to avoid. And there are charlatans even here in the country in which we live. And there are charlatans that throughout the Muslim world as well. And you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater just because there's charlatans that associate with this science that have led other people astray. You learn who are the true people and you stick with them. And unfortunately, Muslims are easily deceived by virtue of their trust in religious people. And that one of the great signs of this is that mixing worldly affairs with your relationship. The true people of Allah don't mix worldly affairs with their relationships. They don't want people to give them anything of the world or what is it they're doing. And they tend to be very, very, very careful and selective that when people want to do things from them, they tend to only accept that from a few close people that they know are truly sincere in that and that know that it will never harm their relationship. Other than that, with everyone else, no. We give, we don't take. This is the way our teachers are. And you have to be careful with these things and know what these criterion are. And especially with the science, because if it relates to an outward science, it's fairly easy. If someone makes a mistake in tafsir, you go back to the great books of tafsir and the great scholars of tafsir. It's much easier to address. But in the science of tasawwuf and of Sufism, when people start talking in the realm of haqaiq and making certain claims and that they can heal people or do this for people and so forth, it's harder to verify, right? And there has to be other people that know whether these people are telling the truth or not. So people can get deceived. So be careful and have a methodology in dealing with this. Give people the benefit of the doubt while you're being careful, though. And that my advice is that make sure that in this science is that the person you're learning from has a knowledge of the Sharia. Make sure they have a knowledge of the sacred law. And if you start to see funny stuff, I'm not saying you have a bad opinion, just protect yourself. But Sharia ultimately is what will determine where something is right or wrong. And I'm not saying that you go and take pictures and put it on Facebook and complain and there could be something you don't understand transpiring. That's possible. Or there could be something wrong, but protect yourself and ask people that you trust. Anyhow, there are people that could fall into this. Is that they know by being a certain way, there's other things that they could receive. And that's obviously a form of misguidance. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. But really what Imam Ibn Al-Ta'a is getting at is that something else. But this is one of the meanings. Or that someone that travels the path and what they want from that is one of the signs of their spiritual wayfaring being authentic to appear, such that people are actually seeking breaking of the norms to happen at their hands or desiring spiritual experiences, right? And all of those things are from the created world. And the nature of the nafs is that it wants to experience what's amazing. It wants to experience a breaking of the norm. On one hand, yes, that gives you certainty. But if you look at the stories of the great awliya that had breaking of the norms happen at their hand, Allah, it made them even more broken before Allah. And it made them even more worried because of how they viewed themselves, that it was istidraj, that Allah was actually leading them astray. Let alone to marvel at it or to brag about it. And generally speaking, the greatest of awliya is that, they were breaking of the norms during their lives, but it's not like it was happening every single day, multiple times a day. It happens from time to time, and there's a whole methodology that the people of Allah have in relation to this. Or there's someone who is traveling the spiritual path, and their goal is some type of physical reward for doing so. This is also related to this meaning of moving from one created thing to another. Or someone seeking lofty degrees of closeness to Allah, and this gets really subtle, for the sake of those lofty degrees, right? And that's probably the most subtle of all of them. We won't go into too much commentary on. That's for the people that have reached that. But the others are fairly understandable. The first one that was mentioned is the worst, obviously, which could actually get someone in really big trouble if they don't correct themselves very quickly. But then the other two, that might, when someone's treading the spiritual path, arise. And what this really gets down to is what motivates us and what are we seeking. And we know, according to a statement of Sayyidina Ali, is that there's three different types of people. There's the servant of Allah, who is like that outwardly a servant. That people who don't do something unless they're forced to do it. And these are people that worship Allah out of fear of the fire. And then a higher degree is like the businessman. Is it someone who worships Allah out of motivation to enter into paradise? But the highest degree is the one who worships Allah because he deserves to be worshipped. Now here you have to be very careful, because you never ever belittle paradise or the fire. That's kufr. That take you outside the fold of Islam. Is that we fear the fire and we hope for paradise. But what he's pointing to here is that the righteous, their fear of the fire and hope for paradise is different than other people. For people that are still in the beginning stages of treading the spiritual path, it's fear out of the punishment itself. It's desiring paradise for the bliss itself. But for the righteous, their fear of the fire is that it is the abode of the wrath of Allah. And for them, knowing that Allah is displeased with them is a greater punishment than the severe torment of actually being in the fire. And both are terrible. But for them, it's a greater punishment, knowing that Allah is displeased with them. Just as in relation to the bliss of the hereafter, the incredible bliss that Allah has in store for His servants is that the bliss that they receive from knowing that Allah is content with them is greater than all of the bliss that they receive in a physical way in paradise. And of course, that bliss is something great. Excuse me. And it's something that we seek. So fear and hope always remain, but they're for different reasons as you move up in the spiritual path, if that makes sense. And the purpose of mentioning that trifold breakdown there was to understand that the highest intention of all, the highest motivation behind worship should be to worship Allah because He deserves to be worshipped. To worship Allah because we are abid, we are servants of Allah. And you could add to that, to worship Allah out of love for Him and longing to know Him. That is the highest motivation of all. And then when you have that overwhelming state of love, and that your goal is just to worship Allah because He deserves to be worshipped, Allah gives you everything. Everything you wanted in relation to salvation from the fire, everything you wanted from the bliss of paradise, and much, much more. He'll give you everything. So in reality, you haven't missed out on anything. You've only gained everything. And the people of Allah know this in every second. It's their state of being. For us, we have to learn that and then do mujahadah to remind ourselves of that. This is for Allah. I'm not doing this for any other reason. And at the basic level, it's perfectly legitimate to not do something out of the fear of the fire. No, it's there for that reason, as a deterrent. It's perfectly legitimate to know that there's a reward associated with something and to do it for that reason. It's there to motivate you. That's why it's there. But as we progress in the spiritual path, the motivation becomes higher. That makes sense? Motivation becomes higher. Is that we're motivated to do everything and we're not belittling what Allah Ta'ala will give by way of reward, but we want His contentment. We want closeness to Him. So all of these examples that were mentioned is that there's movement from one created thing to another. And this is really the point of Ibn Ata'illah. La tarha min kawni la kawn. Don't just move from one created thing to another. Because if you're desiring what your nafs wants, and its hudud, its various portions that manifest in all the ways that were mentioned, the reality is that our metaphor is that of the donkey. You're just going in circles. You're not really getting anywhere spiritually. He's advising us what we need to know so that we can nataraqqa, ascend. And that is the secret of ascension. And there's this beautiful statement of Imam Hassan al-Shadhili, radiallahu anhu, where he says, "Qif bi babi wahid." Stand at the door of the one, door of Allah. "La li tuftah lak al-abwab." Not so that the doors can be open for you. Tuftah lak al-abwab. And then the doors will be open for you. "Wakhda' li sayyidin wahid." That humble yourself before that one master. Maybe the Bibab in front of, stand at the door of one. Not so the doors could open, and then the doors will open. And humble yourself before the one master. لا لتخضع لك الرقاب تنخضع لك الرقاب. Not so that other people will be in awe of you and be submissive to you, but then if you do this, Allah Ta'ala will subjugate His creation. Well, the whole point here is that you do what you're supposed to do. It's very subtle, but it's very important. You do what you're supposed to do. And when you do that, Allah will do what He's promised you to do. He's promised to do for you. You stand at His door. You worship Him. You maintain uprightness upon the path. Do your part. Be sincere. Everything that you learn, put it into practice. Allah will open up door after door after door after door after door for you to come to know Him. And in relation to creation, is that you might see certain religious people that people act a certain way towards them. Oh, so if I'm like this, then this is how people will act towards me. Don't think like that. The people that are really like that don't want that to begin with. If they did, they wouldn't have that. And that in the sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ, it's sunnah to kiss the hands of certain people. It's sunnah to kiss the hand of your parents. It's sunnah to kiss the hand of a righteous scholar or a righteous person. It's sunnah to kiss the hand of a family member of the Prophet ﷺ. There's many examples of this. But one of them used to say is that it would be more beloved for me to be stabbed than to have someone kiss my hand, even though they would let people kiss their hands. So for them, people kissing their hand, they would rather be stabbed than someone to kiss their hands, even though they might let people kiss their hands. And this, of course, is for those, that's their maqam to do so, the great shuyukh, who are completely freed from these things. And that there are people who are very critical of the kissing of hands and so forth, and these are people who don't understand and they are deen properly. And of course, there are people that are immature about this. When it comes to that, brothers like ourselves, is that we give each other a handshake. We don't need to kiss each other's hands. But for the people that are really deserving of it, this is how we should be. And that this is a good practice to put into practice. And so that, again, it gets back to intention. And so what he's really encouraging us to do here then is to raise our spiritual aspiration. And so that we desire only closest to Allah. We desire only for Allah to be content with. We desire only knowledge of Allah. This is what we should be seeking. And then he quotes the verse to prove how this is what we should be seeking. وَأَنَّ إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ الْمُنْتَهَى. And Ibn Ajiba says in his tafsir, in the ishara, the spiritual illusion of this, انتهى سير السائرين إلى الوصول إلى الله, is that the traveler of the travelers, the spiritual traveler, the spiritual travel of the spiritual travelers ends in what? In arriving to Allah, وَالْعُكُوفِ حَضْرَتِهِ, and forever remaining in His presence. In other words, they come to know Him. He says, وَمَعْنَى الْوُصُولِ إِلَى اللَّهِ, what arriving to Allah means is الْعِلْمِ بِأَحَدِيَّةِ وُجُودِهِ, is that knowledge of his solitary existence, subhanahu wa ta'ala, is al-ahad, tabarak wa ta'ala, is the one. And so this really is the goal. And as for the person who is traveling the spiritual path, but is just delighting in other created things, person is not intelligent. This person is just going around in circles like that donkey. And ultimately, he's being guided by his hawa, being guided by his desire. And the way that we move from created things to the Creator and travel to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and go to Him is done by three things. The first is قصر همتك عليه دون ما سواه. Is that only desire. Part of our aspiration is only desiring closest to Him. The second is الرجعة إليه بإقامة الحقوق والفرار من الحدود. Is that we return to Him by giving rights to all of those who have rights upon us and trying not to let our nafs receive its portion, or even desire that portion. And then the third is دوام اللجاء إليه, constantly turning to Him. والاستعانة به, seeking His help. والتوكل عليه, relying upon Him. والاستسلام, and submitting لما يريد عليك, to every situation that He puts you in. This is how we move from created things to the Creator. It's done with aspiration, and that's the foundation. And then learning what are all the hudud of the nafs. Because the thing is that once you start worshiping, you start to see that Allah starts facilitating things for you. And then you got to be careful because you're like, oh, I'm going to keep worshiping because I like this facilitation. Right? Or you start seeing that, my God, I've made several prayers that have been answered. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing so I can get my prayers answered. No. You don't worship for that facilitation. You don't worship for those prayers to get answered, let alone because of the way people are respecting you or something like that. Or you might see a dream. You might see something beautiful. You might have a powerful spiritual experience. You might find ladha. You might find sweetness in worship. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm going to keep worshiping. This is sweet. And so your intention gets polluted by what it is that you're doing. And what he's saying here is himma. In all of these hudud of the nafs, don't let yourself, you catch yourself, if you will, as soon as it arises. Right? And Imam al-Ghazali has an incredible list of them in his book on intention, sincerity, and truthfulness. He has an incredible list of them. And things, little subtle things like, see someone has a big janazah. I want to be a certain way so that I can have a big janazah. Praying on people's janazah so that you can have a big janazah. Catch yourself. Khalas. Right? I want to be a certain way. If I'm giving, I know people that didn't, a lot of people are going to attend my janazah. No. You might have a few people attending your janazah and be from the kibar of al-awliya. You might have a lot of people attending your janazah and you could just be a normal person. Or you could have a lot of people attending your janazah and you're from the kibar of the awliya. All of those are possibilities. But the size itself is not necessarily the criterion. Yes, there's narrations that indicate that a certain amount of people pray and it's a sign of salvation. In terms of salvation, yes. In terms of the higher degrees of closeness to Allah, it's not necessarily a sign. It can be, not necessarily. So, aspiration, not letting your nafs get its health. And again, I would go back to that book in the Ihya, it's translated, and you can start to see all these examples of what he says. And there's a lot. And then relying upon him completely, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anyway, and then he says that using the words of our Prophet ﷺ to further his point, and indicating that the foundational matter, which is one of himma, high aspiration, this was indicated in the words of our Prophet ﷺ. What is it we have to do? How do we raise our spiritual aspiration? What do we have to turn away from? And this is where he says, Wandur, consider the Prophet's words, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Whoever migrated to Allah in His Messenger, then his migration was to Allah in His Messenger. Allahu Akbar. Meaning that if this was the intention, to draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to that receive reward from Him, then this is exactly what someone will receive. And as for someone who has some type of worldly intention, they want worldly gain, or the specific example of that wanting to marry a woman, and there was someone who actually did this, or any other manifestation that of a worldly pursuit. This is the meaning of al-iltihal min al-akwan ila this is the meaning of that moving from cone to cone. So the first part of this hadith corresponds to what he wants us to do. Irhal min al-akwan al-mukawwan. That go from created things to the Creator. Right? This is the first example, right? Hijr ilallahi wa rasulih. And then the second part of this is that doing it for worldly gain is what he tells us not to do. La tarhal min kawnin ila kawn. Do not go from one created thing to another. Right? Outwardly you went from Mecca to Medina, but you went for a worldly purpose. And this is not something that we want to do. And this word hijra, which is the word in Arabic for migration, it's moving from one place to another. And you're leaving something for something else. And that Ibn Ajib has a beautiful thing where he says here, is that the meanings of migration are three. Min watan al-ma'siyah ila watan al-ta'ah. You're migrating from acts of disobedience to acts of obedience. Min watan al-ghafla ila watan al-yaqadha. You're migrating from heedlessness to wakefulness. وَمِنْ وَطَنِ عَالَمِ الْأَشْبَاحِ إِلَى وَطَنِ عَالَمِ الْأَرْوَاحِ. You're migrating from the sensory realm to the abode of spirits, to the spiritual realm. And there's even deeper understandings there as well. He says from the mulk to the malakut, from the dominion to the celestial realm, from sensory to meaning, and from knowledge of certainty to the eye of certainty, and so forth and so on. So whoever migrates from these places, that seeking with his migration arrival to Allah, arriving to the contentment of Allah, to the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then is that his migration will lead him to what it is that he is seeking. And this is essentially what he's trying to teach us. His migration will be to what it is that he is seeking. The result and that he will receive what it is that he is seeking. And so that we can turn away from what will bar us from this and that turn towards our Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he ends this by saying, وَتَأَمَّلْ هَذَا الْأَمْرِ فَافْهَمْ قَوْلُ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ. So understand his saying, prayer and peace upon him. Understand it. Think about what he's saying in light of what he just told us and how it's a reflection of that meaning. And then he says, وَالسَّلَامُ. فافهم قوله عليه الصلاة والسلام وتأمل هذا الأمر إن كنت ذا فهم والسلام. And contemplate this matter if you have understanding. So people that understand this will be people of fahm. And you start to realize here with statements like this how the knowledge of the heart is so important to the traveling of the spiritual path. And you might have two people that are doing something similar outwardly, but because of someone's in-depth knowledge of the heart, their perspective, the purity of their intentions, what it is that they're seeking. In reality, one is way ahead in the spiritual path of the others. And in a world where quantity tends to remain over quality, and people are obsessed with the outward dimension of things, this becomes something especially important for us. And then he ends by saying, wassalam, and that literally, peace. And one of the meanings there is that this matter is clear and doesn't need to be clarified any further. Wassalam. This matter is crystal clear, and it affects the heart the way that it was said like that, so that we can know that he's clarified to us the truth, and now it's just a matter of that inculcating this within ourselves. May Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala give us tawfiq and open the doors of all good for all of us, and to bless us to be able to worship like the elect of the awliya and the salihin. May Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala teach us that which benefits us and benefit us through which he teaches us, and to increase us in knowledge, Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, always, Ya Arhamar Rahimeen, and to bless us to move up in the degrees of closest to him and come to know him, Tabarak wa Ta'ala, and to purify our intentions and bless us to be able to worship him because he deserves to be worshipped, Ya Arhamar Rahimeen, to put everything in its place at every stage of the path. And ultimately, may all of us have an overwhelming desire to come to know him. And may Allah Ta'ala actualize that for all of us, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And may that seed be planted here in this world. And ultimately, the fruits of it be harvested forever, eternally in the next. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.